The story you are about to hear was never meant to survive. It was whispered in corridors, buried in sealed records, and smothered beneath the weight of polite society's silence. Yet it remained, like a disease beneath the skin of history, waiting to erupt. The year is 1892. Virginia. A clerk in Richmond's courthouse basement opens a dust-choked box of forgotten files. He expects shipping records, maybe old tax ledgers. Instead, he finds something else, pages bound in twine, their ink still legible, though eaten by mold at the edges. He reads only a few lines before his hands begin to tremble. He closes the box. He tries to forget, but the words follow him. They follow him into his sleep. Because these were not records of a simple estate. They were confessions, legal documents recording a secret arrangement so grotesque that when it was first uncovered, 3 judges refused to preside over the trial. A case so morally corrosive that the church declared it too dangerous for the public to know. It was buried, locked away, denied. But the truth has a way of rotting beneath denial, and when it finally comes to the surface, the stench is unbearable. Imagine this, a child raised not merely as a daughter, not merely as an heir, but also prepared, groomed, and bound to become something else, to fill 2 roles at once, roles that should never cross, to be, simultaneously, daughter and bride. That was the Hawthorne arrangement, and behind its polished curtains of refinement, behind its hymns and tobacco wealth, it concealed something every empire fears, a ritual of control so absolute that even bloodlines were twisted into chains. Ask yourself, why would powerful families commit to such arrangements? Was it simply lust? No, that would be too simple. This was about consolidation, about the iron law of keeping wealth and power contained, unmixed, untouched by outsiders. What began as whispers of dynasty curdled into something darker. Fathers who swore they were guardians became architects of a future too vile to speak aloud. And daughters were rewritten into symbols of obedience, vessels of continuity, locked into destinies they never chose. The Hawthorne case was never meant for your eyes. Men of power tried to bury it forever. Yet here it is, crawling back into the present, daring you to look. Once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Because in this story, the line between protection and possession dissolves, and once you understand that line, your understanding of history, of families, of power itself will never be the same. Henrico County, Virginia. The Hawthorne estate stood like a fortress of elegance against the rolling fields, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun, its gardens trimmed into perfection. To outsiders it was a monument to southern refinement, a place of prayer, tobacco wealth, and quiet discipline. But appearances are lies carved in stone. Behind the shutters of Hawthorne Hall, order was not order, it was orchestration. Control disguised as tradition, and at the center of it all was patriarch Thomas Hawthorne. Thomas was no ordinary man. To his neighbors he was a war hero turned statesman, a benefactor to the local church, a patron of education. His reputation was spotless, his name spoken in admiration at Richmond dinners, but every polished surface hides a crack, and his crack was an obsession older than himself. He carried in his study a set of letters, yellowed with age, written by his grandfather, each one repeating the same commandment. The Hawthorne blood must never leave the Hawthorne line. A fortune divided is a fortune destroyed. A family scattered is a family erased. Do you see it? This was no isolated perversion. It was a philosophy, a doctrine of inheritance disguised as duty. One generation writes the law in blood, and the next enforces it, even when it corrodes the soul. Thomas Hawthorne lived by this creed with the precision of Scripture. His wife, Mary, died in childbirth when their daughter was only a year old. He never remarried, not because he lacked opportunity. No, he refused because he saw in his daughter not merely a child, but an heir designed to carry both the name and the body of Hawthorne legacy. To him, she was not Elizabeth Hawthorne. She was the continuation, daughter, and in time, bride. Do you feel the unease yet? This is how control metastasizes. It never declares itself openly. It whispers, cloaks itself in respectability, waits patiently until it can reframe the grotesque as necessity. The neighbors saw a devoted widower. They saw a father who refused to risk another wife's death. They applauded his sacrifice, and all the while, behind his locked doors, a plan unfolded, one that would stretch Elizabeth's identity into a shape that no human being was meant to bear. The records do not show her resistance because her resistance was methodically broken, piece by piece, lesson by lesson, and the world applauded the discipline of the Hawthorne household, never realizing they were clapping for the sound of chains. Elizabeth Hawthorne grew up beneath ceilings that seemed to watch her. The halls of Hawthorne Hall were filled with portraits, stern men with powdered hair, solemn women clutching rosaries, all staring down as if to remind her, "You belong to us, you are us, you will continue us." A child learns quickly what is expected when silence is more dangerous than words, and Elizabeth learned silence better than anyone. Thomas Hawthorne spared nothing in her education. Tutors came from Richmond, each instructed in precise tones. Teach her refinement, teach her obedience, teach her memory, but leave her spirit untouched. You see the trick? He wanted intelligence without independence, refinement without rebellion, a polished vessel, not a person, the kind of education that seems noble on paper, but in practice is nothing less than grooming. Elizabeth's daily life was a theater of control. At breakfast, Thomas quizzed her on scripture, at supper, on history, and between meals, she was taught the manners of the wife she would one day be, though she did not yet understand that the role she was rehearsing was meant for him. She learned to pour tea with exact grace, to stitch table linens without flaw, to speak softly but never too softly, always enough to show intelligence, never enough to suggest will. A child raised not to live, but to serve. The neighbors admired her discipline. They called her the perfect young lady, unaware that every compliment they gave was another brick in her cage. Because what happens when a girl is praised for obedience? She learns to kill her own questions before they form. She learns that silence is safer than truth. And in that silence, Thomas shaped her into the image he required. But there is something important here, something history doesn't want you to notice. This was not just about one man's perverse hunger, it was an institutional logic, famille. Lies like the Hawthornes were taught to consolidate power at all costs. Religion gave them cover, the law gave them tools, and silence gave them freedom to operate in the shadows. What looks like a single monstrous act is, in truth, a pattern, repeated across generations, whispered across bloodlines, buried in church records and courthouse files that no one dares to open. Elizabeth was not the first, and she would not be the last. It began with small intrusions, a father's hand resting too long on his daughter's shoulder, a gaze that lingered not with pride but with possession. Elizabeth noticed, though she did not yet have the words to describe it. She was 14 when the atmosphere in Hawthorne Hall shifted. What had been veiled as discipline became something else, an invisible tightening of the leash. Thomas spoke to her not as a child, but as a partner in preparation. He began using the phrase, "You are the key to our survival." At first, she thought he meant the family fortune, the estate, the fields stretching beyond the horizon, but then he began weaving the phrase into every interaction. When she poured his tea correctly, "Yes, you see, Elizabeth, you are the key to our survival." When she recited scripture flawlessly, "Exactly, daughter, you will preserve us." It was flattery sharpened into programming, a constant reminder that her worth was not her own. By 15, the estate staff knew to step aside when Thomas and Elizabeth walked together. They whispered, but never loudly. Servants learned quickly which truths kill careers and which whispers kill lives. The tutor, Miss Fenwick, lasted the longest. She noticed the change in tone, the unholy intimacy of the household. Her letters to a friend in Richmond hinted at unease. "It is as though she is both child and consort. He speaks of her as if she belongs to him twice over. I fear what the future holds." That letter never reached its destination. History tells us Fenwick was dismissed for ill health. In reality, she vanished from records entirely. Elizabeth was alone now, alone with a man whose authority was absolute, whose voice filled every corner of her existence. She was taught to smile when he entered the room, to laugh softly at his sharp humor, to receive gifts as tokens of loyalty, pearls for obedience, books for silence, dresses for submission. Each present was not a kindness, but a brick in the structure of ownership. Here is where the sickness hides, not in violence, but in ritualized acceptance. No locked door, no raised voice, only the gradual erosion of boundaries until the unthinkable becomes the inevitable. Thomas was not grooming a wife to bring into his house, he was grooming a wife already inside it, and Elizabeth, still too young to define her unease, was becoming exactly what he needed her to be: obedient, refined, complicit in her own rewriting. She was not yet aware, but history was. On Elizabeth's 16th birthday, the masquerade ended. Hawthorne Hall hosted a gathering, candles in every window, wine flowing for neighbors who admired Thomas's wealth but never questioned its origin. To them, it was a celebration of a girl becoming a woman. But beneath the veneer of polite society, it was something darker, a rehearsal for her initiation into the role Thomas had long prepared. Elizabeth wore a dress of ivory silk, too bridal for a child, too deliberate to be mistaken. Thomas insisted she stand beside him as he greeted guests, her arm tucked neatly into his as though they were equals. No, not equals. Partners. The conversations were veiled, yet laced with insinuation. One guest remarked, "She carries herself like the lady of the house already." Another chuckled. Hawthorne blood breeds strong alliances. Elizabeth's cheeks burned, but she smiled as instructed. She had learned by then that silence was the currency of survival. And then came the toast. Thomas raised his glass, his words sharp and slow. "To my Elizabeth, the key to our survival, the continuation of all we are." The room erupted in polite applause, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what was truly being declared. But Elizabeth knew, in that moment, the whispers, the lessons, the strange intimacy of her father's gaze all converged into a horrifying clarity. She was not being raised to leave the Hawthorne bloodline. She was being raised to bind herself to it. That night, in the candlelit hush of the hall, Thomas placed a ring in her hand. Not gold, but iron, cold, unyielding, forged as though it belonged not on her finger, but on a chain. He said only, "You are mine, and through you, we will live forever." It was not yet consummated, but it was sealed, a covenant carved in silence, witnessed only by God and the portraits on the wall, those hollow-eyed ancestors who seemed to approve from their frames. Understand this. What happened in Hawthorne Hall was not a sudden break in morality. It was the culmination of centuries of practice, whispered through elite families who cloaked their sickness in ritual. To them, blood was more sacred than love, continuity mattered more than consent, and religion, yes, even the church, looked the other way, because what was wealth if not proof of God's favor? Elizabeth was now bound, not only as daughter, but as something far worse. After the ring was placed in her hand, Elizabeth felt the walls of Hawthorne Hall close in. Each corridor seemed narrower, each portrait heavier. The estate had always been her cage, but now it was sanctified as a tomb for her will. Her daily life changed subtly, yet decisively. Thomas no longer called her child, he called her lady. At meals she sat at his right hand, the place once reserved for her late mother. When guests visited, Thomas deferred to her with deliberate ceremony, as though signaling her ascension. It was not love, it was theater. A rehearsed performance of marriage without vows, a masquerade too twisted to name. But Elizabeth was not entirely pliant. Inside her something stirred. She began to test the edges of her cage. When Thomas praised her silence, she spoke more. When he gifted her pearls, she left them on the table. He did not punish these small rebellions, not with his hand at least, but with something sharper. Withdrawal. His silence would stretch across days, suffocating, until she bent back toward obedience simply to feel the weight of his attention again. This was not discipline, it was starvation. Elizabeth began journaling in secret. Hidden beneath the loose board of her floor, she kept scraps of parchment filled with words too dangerous to speak aloud. "I am both prisoner and priestess. He binds me to him with scripture, but I feel it is a lie. If I remain silent, I will cease to exist. If I speak, I may not survive." There were moments when she thought escape was possible. The servant boy, Jonathan, once brushed her hand while pouring water, and for an instant she saw recognition in his eyes, a knowing of her captivity. But by morning, Jonathan was gone. The official story said he sought work in another town. Elizabeth knew better. Hawthorne Hall had swallowed him, as it swallowed all who glimpsed too closely. It was then, he realized, there would be no help. The church was deaf, the neighbors blind, the staff mute. She stood alone at the center of a ritual written long before she was born, a ritual that demanded not just her obedience but her complete erasure as a person. Yet within her silence, something dangerous was growing, a seed of defiance, not yet visible, but alive. Defiance never begins with fire. It begins with sparks, small, almost invisible, but enough to announce that something living resists the weight of suffocation. For Elizabeth, the spark came one autumn evening. Thomas had summoned her to the library, the room most drenched in ritual. Its shelves groaned with books on genealogy, scripture annotated in the margins, treatises on bloodlines, all arranged with the obsessive care of a man who worshipped continuity above God. On the table before him lay a massive ledger, the Hawthorne family record. Each generation, each marriage, each child's name inked in meticulous script. It was a book not of history, but of control. Thomas opened to a blank page, handed her the quill, and said, "Write your name, Elizabeth Hawthorne. Soon another shall be beside it." He meant his own. He meant to bind her there forever. Elizabeth's hand trembled, but instead of obeying, she hesitated. She dipped the quill, let the ink swell on its tip, and then deliberately allowed a blot to fall across the page, a single black wound on the family record, a stain that could never be erased. Thomas froze. For a moment his face flickered between rage and calculation. Then, with a voice low enough to chill the marrow, he said, "You forget yourself." But Elizabeth did not apologize. She looked directly at him, a dangerous act in itself, and whispered, "I did not forget. I remembered." The silence that followed was unbearable. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, yet time seemed arrested. Thomas closed the ledger slowly, as though to bury the blot inside, then dismissed her with a wave. That night she waited for punishment, but it never came. Instead, Thomas's behavior shifted. He grew quieter, watchful, like a man studying a serpent he had once thought harmless. Elizabeth's rebellion had not broken her chains, but it had done something more dangerous. It had revealed them. She now understood that her father's control was not omnipotent. It thrived on her compliance, her willingness to be written into his book. By smearing the page, she had shown that she still possessed one thing he could not command, her refusal. It was the first strike in a silent war. Thomas Hawthorne was not a man who raised his hand in violence. He did not need to. His weapon was subtler, more enduring. He ruled by atmosphere, by silence, by the slow erosion of another's will, until they mistook submission for their own choice. After Elizabeth's blot of ink, he did not strike, did not scold, did not even mention the defiance again. Instead, he altered the air she breathed. He became careful in his distance, allowing his presence to weigh on her without ever speaking the words she longed and dreaded to hear. At meals, he stared at her too long before blessing the food. When she entered a room, he rose to his feet with exaggerated ceremony, as though mocking her place beside him. He gifted her objects of grotesque symbolism, a lace veil, a silver hand mirror, a rosary that had belonged to her mother. Each was meant as a reminder, "You are mine, you are bride, you are bound." Elizabeth began to feel hunted in her own home, not by footsteps in the night, but by expectation itself. Thomas was building a cage around her mind, room by room, thought by thought. The worst came during evening prayers. Traditionally, they knelt before the family altar in silence, but one night, Thomas opened the Bible and read aloud from Ephesians, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord." His tone was calm, but his eyes never left her. It was not scripture. It was a blade sharpened on her soul. Elizabeth did not answer, but inside, her thoughts screamed, "I am not wife, I am daughter." Yet her silence betrayed her. Thomas smiled faintly, as though he had drawn blood without lifting a finger. Still she held her secret journal. Still the seed of defiance smoldered. If she could not speak, she would write. If she could not leave, she would dream. And in those words, scratched in haste and hidden beneath the floorboards, she carved a truth more dangerous than her father's rituals. He is not eternal. He can be broken. It was the first time she dared to imagine his downfall, and imagination is the birthplace of rebellion. A house may have gates and walls, but its truest prison is isolation. Thomas knew this, and so he worked tirelessly to ensure Elizabeth never had an ally beyond his reach. Servants were rotated frequently, never allowed to grow close. Letters were monitored, censored, or destroyed, and yet Elizabeth found her moment. It happened on a gray afternoon when the local physician, Dr. Whitcomb, arrived to examine Thomas's failing joints. Elizabeth was ordered to serve tea. For the first time in months, she stood within arm's reach of someone not bound by Hawthorne blood. Her hands trembled as she poured, and when Thomas's gaze shifted momentarily toward the fire, She acted. Beneath the cup, she slipped a folded scrap of paper, torn hastily from her journal, written in cramped, desperate script. Only 4 words. I am not safe. Her pulse thundered as the doctor accepted the tea. He glanced at her, eyes widening almost imperceptibly, before tucking the paper discreetly into his coat pocket. For the rest of the visit, Elizabeth felt both terror and exhilaration. She had breached the walls, if only by a hairline crack. But Thomas Hawthorne was not a man easily deceived. That night, Elizabeth noticed a subtle shift. He spoke warmly at supper, praised her posture, even offered her a glass of sherry, something he had never permitted before. It was too smooth, too deliberate, and when the house fell to silence, he visited her chamber unannounced. In his hand was the very scrap of paper she had given the doctor. Elizabeth froze. Her mouth went dry. How had he intercepted it? Did the doctor betray her, or had Thomas's reach extended further than she ever dared to imagine? He did not raise his voice. Instead, he sat at the foot of her bed, unfolded the note, and read it aloud slowly, savoring each syllable like a liturgy. Then he looked at her, calm as a viper before striking, and whispered, "Safety does not exist, my child. There is only obedience." Elizabeth did not cry. She did not plead. She stared into his eyes and forced herself to remain silent, though inside her body screamed. For the first time she felt not merely trapped, but hunted. And yet, even in terror, one conviction hardened. If her father could intercept her cry for help, it meant he feared her voice, and fear, even in a tyrant, was a fracture. Thomas Hawthorne understood a cruel truth. Breaking the body was simple, but bending the mind ensured obedience without chains. And so, when Elizabeth's attempt at escape was revealed, he did not punish her with beatings or confinement. Instead, he wove her guilt into ritual. He began with confession. At dusk, he led her into the parlor where her mother's portrait loomed, a pale woman whose eyes seemed to follow every movement. A single candle flickered before the frame, casting shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the floor. "Your mother listens," Thomas whispered. "Tell her what you have done." Elizabeth's throat closed. She tried to protest, but his stare bore into her until the silence became unbearable. At last, trembling, she whispered, "I betrayed you." Thomas nodded with satisfaction. "Say it again, but clearer." She obeyed, again and again, until the words lost all meaning, becoming a chant carved into her own memory. That night he gave her pen and paper, not to write freely, but to copy passages of scripture chosen by him, verses of submission, of obedience, of wives yielding to husbands. For hours she transcribed until her hand cramped, each line a slow burial of her own thoughts beneath his. Worse still, he began to invert the rituals she had once cherished. Prayer became theater, songs of devotion became hymns to obedience. And always, her mother's portrait looked on, a silent accomplice to her father's designs. Elizabeth began to doubt herself. Was she complicit? Was her resistance truly betrayal? Was she, as Thomas whispered, already wife in spirit, merely waiting for the flesh to follow? But even in this suffocating fog, fragments of clarity survived. Late at night, when Thomas finally left her chamber, she tore the copied verses into shreds and pressed her forehead against the cool floorboards where her journal was hidden. There, in secret ink, she rewrote her truth. "His words are poison. My silence is not agreement. I remain my own." Every ritual he imposed became double-edged. Outwardly she submitted. Inwardly she stored the venom, transforming it into a quiet fury. She understood at last. His control depended not on her destruction, but on her agreement. And she would never give it. The Hawthorne estate was designed to stand apart, a fortress of stone perched above the town like a watchful eye, but walls cannot stop whispers, and soon Elizabeth began to notice the subtle tremors of doubt in those who orbited her father's rule. It began with the servants. A maid, young and plain, lingered too long while delivering bread. Her eyes, quick and nervous, flicked toward Elizabeth's wrists, as if searching for unseen shackles. An older housekeeper crossed herself whenever Thomas passed, muttering under her breath as though warding off something profane. Then came the villagers. From the narrow windows of the carriage, Elizabeth caught their stares, too sharp, too long. They bowed politely to Thomas, yes, but the bows were stiff, mechanical, lacking reverence. Once a child on the roadside called out, "Cursed house," before being swiftly dragged away by his mother. Thomas, of course, noticed all of it, and he wore their unease like armor. "They envy us," he told Elizabeth as the carriage wheels cut through gravel. "They despise what they cannot comprehend. Do not look to them for truth. They are cattle." But Elizabeth saw something her father could not: fear. And fear meant power was not absolute. Fear meant cracks. One evening, as Thomas retired to his study, Elizabeth lingered in the corridor and overheard two servants whispering. Their voices trembled, but their words carried weight. "They say his wife didn't die in childbirth." "Then how? Speak no more, or will be heard." Her heart pounded. The portrait of her mother, the endless rituals, the strange, suffocating grief in the house, suddenly they sharpened into suspicion. What truth had Thomas buried beneath these walls? What had really become of the woman whose ghost loomed over every meal, every prayer, every command? For the first time, Elizabeth's fear was not of her father's punishments, but of the shadows he kept hidden. And in that fear lay an ember of resolve. If the villagers and servants suspected the Hawthorne legacy was poisoned, then perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to drag his secrets into light. But she also knew Thomas did not tolerate curiosity. One misstep, one glance too long at forbidden doors, and her silent rebellion could end not in freedom, but in a grave beside the woman whose eyes haunted her every night. The house itself seemed to pulse with secrets, as though its corridors had absorbed every whispered lie, every forbidden act, and now exhaled them back to anyone who dared listen. Elizabeth had spent her entire life inside these walls, yet only now did she feel them shifting, like a living thing watching her, warning her, daring her to probe further. It was late one night, the air damp with a coming storm, when she first resolved to seek answers. Thomas had locked himself in his study, the low hum of his muttering prayers seeping beneath the door. She moved barefoot, each step careful, her heart thudding against her ribs. Her path led her toward the east wing, the part of the house rarely entered except for cleaning. Dust covered the furniture there, and the air smelled of rot and mildew. She remembered this was where her mother once spent most of her days, before her sudden illness. At the end of the hall, a door stood locked. She had rattled its handle once as a child, and was struck across the face for her curiosity. Now, years later, she placed her palm against its wood and felt an odd coldness seep into her skin. She pressed her ear to it. Silence. But silence can conceal more than sound. Turning back, she searched the surrounding rooms, desperate for a key, a clue, anything. It was in the small sewing chamber adjacent to the hall that she found it. A loose board beneath the carpet. Beneath it lay scraps, shreds of paper with handwriting that was not her father's. The ink was faded, but the words cut sharp into her mind. "I fear he watches me, even in sleep. If I am gone, no, it was not the fever." Her breath caught. This was her mother's hand. The room suddenly seemed smaller, the air heavy, as though the house itself pressed down on her discovery. She shoved the scraps into her dress and fled to her chamber, her hands trembling as though she carried poison. Lying awake, she stared at the ceiling beams, the storm outside pounding against the windows. The truth was no longer a faint suspicion. It was alive, hidden in these walls, begging her to exhume it. But with each discovery came danger. If Thomas knew she had even touched the ghost of her mother's words, his wrath would not be symbolic, it would be final. And yet Elizabeth knew she could not stop. The lock would be opened, the past would speak. The forbidden door loomed larger with each passing day. Its locked frame seemed to breathe in the shadows of the east wing, as though guarding something too dreadful for daylight. Elizabeth could feel it pulling at her, an invisible tether, tightening every time she passed. Her mother's scraps of writing burned in her memory. "If I am gone, no, it was not the fever." That single line twisted everything she had ever been told. The fever was Thomas's explanation. The fever was the lie. But if not the fever, then what? One night, when the moon hung pale and swollen, Elizabeth slipped from her chamber once more. She carried a candle, its trembling flame no steadier than her own breath. The corridor stretched before her like a throat swallowing her into silence. At the forbidden door she knelt, her fingers grazing the iron lock. She had no key, but desperation breeds invention. From her dress she pulled a thin hairpin and pressed it into the keyhole, mimicking motions she had once glimpsed when a servant fumbled with old cabinets. The metal scraped and caught, sweat slid down her temple, her heart thudded so loud she feared it might draw him to her. And then, click. The sound was so sharp it seemed to echo across the hall. She froze, listening, praying. No footsteps, no voice, only her own shallow breathing. Slowly, carefully, she pushed the door open. The air that escaped was rank, thick with dust and something sweeter, fouler, the stench of rot. She raised her candle and stepped inside. The room was not empty. Draped sheets hung over furniture like shrouds. A dressing table lined with bottles of powders and tinctures sat undisturbed, as though waiting for a hand that would never return. On the bed lay a shape beneath a yellowed quilt. Elizabeth's knees weakened. She stepped closer, trembling. She pulled back the edge of the quilt, and there, dried and withered, lay the remnants of her mother's gown. The body itself was gone, but scraps of hair, fragments of bone, lingered in the bedding. Her candlelight flickered against the walls, and she saw the truth etched into the plaster. Frantic scratch marks, a woman's nails clawing at confinement. Elizabeth staggered back, choking on the air, pressing her hand to her mouth to silence the scream rising in her throat. Her mother had not died peacefully. She had been locked away. And if Thomas could do this to his wife, what fate awaited the daughter he had bound as both child and bride? The door groaned as Elizabeth pulled it shut, her hand shaking so violently she nearly dropped the candle. She pressed her back against the wood, willing her heart to still. But the echo of those scratch marks was louder than her pulse. Her mother had not been lost to illness. She had been imprisoned, left to wither, forgotten by all but the walls themselves. Elizabeth staggered down the corridor, the air heavy with rot, still clinging to her hair and dress. But before she could retreat to the safety of her chamber, a sound froze her mid-step. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing along the wooden floorboards. Thomas's voice followed, low and steady, humming a hymn she had been forced to copy just nights before. Each note slid through the hallway like a knife. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. If he saw her outside her room, if he smelled the decay on her, there would be no excuse strong enough to save her. She glanced around desperately. A narrow alcove stood just ahead, where a tall grandfather clock ticked in patient indifference. She pressed herself into the shadows beside it, clutching her candle so tightly the wax dented into her palm. She blew out the flame with trembling lips, plunging herself into darkness. The footsteps drew closer. His humming grew clearer, and then he stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. She held her breath, her body stiff, every muscle screaming not to move. The clock's pendulum swung in agonizing rhythm, each tick louder than her own heartbeat. Elizabeth. Thomas's voice floated into the dark. Not angry, not loud, but searching. Are you awake? Her throat constricted. The urge to answer, to give herself away, was overwhelming, but she bit down hard on her lip until the taste of iron filled her mouth. The footsteps shifted. A pause, and then, slowly, they receded. His hymn resumed, fainter and fainter, until at last, the hall swallowed it whole. Elizabeth's legs nearly gave beneath her. She slid to the floor, shaking, her candle broken in two at her feet. She wanted to scream, to weep, to collapse entirely, but she dared not. Instead, she whispered into the silence, her voice trembling yet fierce, "You will not keep me as you kept her." And for the first time, she believed it. Elizabeth lay awake in her chamber, the storm having moved on, but leaving the house steeped in a silence more dreadful than thunder. She turned the fragments of her mother's note over in her hands again and again until the edges tore at her skin. If I am gone, no, it was not the fever. Those words burned into her like a brand. Her mother's fate was no longer speculation. It was a sentence carried out within these very walls. But what haunted her most was not the truth of her death, but the method. A locked door. Scratch marks, a silence imposed by her father, then handed down like inheritance. She realized then, Thomas thrived on silence. His entire system of control depended on it. Silence in the halls, silence at the dinner table, silence in the chapel room where he forced her to kneel until her legs gave way. To speak, to question, was rebellion. So she would use it against him. Over the next days she observed him with sharpened precision. She noticed the way he always locked the study before retreating to bed. She noticed how his rituals began and ended at precise hours, just before dawn, just after dusk, and most of all, she noticed his complacency. Thomas believed her broken, a silent vessel carved into obedience. That belief would blind him. Elizabeth began to move in the shadows of his routines. When he prayed, she listened through the cracks in the door, memorizing his words, his pauses, even the rhythm of his breaths. When he left for the town parish to speak with the elders, she searched his chambers, never long, but long enough to notice that one key on his ring was always separated from the rest, wrapped in a thin strip of leather as though marked sacred. That would be the key. She did not yet know how to take it, but she understood one thing with certainty. The forbidden room in the east wing had not finished speaking to her. Whatever truth her motifs had carved into those walls, Elizabeth would draw it out, even if it meant being consumed by the same darkness. As she folded the scraps of paper into the lining of her dress, a bitter calm settled over her. She was no longer merely Thomas's daughter, nor his bride. She was his shadow, watching, waiting, preparing to unmake him in the silence he so worshipped. The key. It glimmered in her mind like a forbidden relic, its thin strip of leather separating it from the rest of Thomas's ring. Every time she saw him draw the ring from his pocket, every time the metal clinked faintly against the wooden table, she felt its pull. Elizabeth knew that to reach it she could not rely on strength. Thomas was never careless with his hands, never without his eyes searching, but his faith, his certainty that she was bound, docile, obedient, would be his undoing. Her chance came at supper. The storm had left the world damp and chilled, so Thomas had ordered a fire lit in the hearth. The flames cast their glow across his austere figure as he bowed his head in prayer, muttering grace with the same feverish weight he gave to sermons. His hand rested on the table, his keys just beside the bowl of bread. Elizabeth lowered her gaze, imitating the meekness he demanded, while her mind raced with calculation. Every word he spoke stretched time, every pause was a window. When he raised his head and reached for the bread, she deliberately dropped her spoon. It clattered against the floor, echoing far louder than she intended, but she did not flinch. Instead, she slid from her chair, gathering it with calm hands, while keeping her eyes downcast. Her movements carried her just close enough to the table's edge. The keys dangled, swaying ever so slightly from their leather cord. Her fingers twitched with longing, but she forced herself still. To snatch them now would be suicide. Instead, she studied them. The leather wrapping was old, frayed at the edges. The key itself was long, narrow, made not for common locks, but for something ancient, deliberate. "Elizabeth," Thomas's voice cut through the firelight. She froze. Slowly she raised her head. His eyes bore into her, sharp as a blade. For a heartbeat, she thought he had seen her lingering gaze. "Yea, I will pray aloud tonight," he said. Her heart steadied. She bowed her head once more, whispering the words he had forced into her mouth 100 times. But as her lips shaped the prayers, her mind spoke another truth entirely. Soon, she would have that key, and when she did, the silence of Hawthorne House would finally break. That night, long after Thomas's footsteps faded down the hall, Elizabeth remained awake, her body rigid beneath the weight of the darkness. She could hear the wind pressing against the shutters, the occasional groan of the old timbers, but above all, she could hear the faintest metallic rattle, Thomas placing the key ring on the stand beside his bed. She had learned his rhythms well. He prayed, extinguished the lamp, set the keys aside, then lay down as though the day had emptied him. His trust in silence, in her stillness, was complete. Elizabeth waited. She counted the passing of minutes by the slowing of his breath, until it became the heavy tide of sleep. She rose, barefoot, her dress whispering against the floor. The corridor between their chambers seemed endless, each shadow stretching like an arm reaching to pull her back. Yet when she reached his door, she paused, listening. His snores came steady, a beast lulled into slumber. The door creaked faintly as she pressed it open. She slipped inside, the air heavy with his presence, the faint scent of smoke and candle wax, the authority of a man who ruled every stone of this house. Her eyes fixed on the stand, the keys. She moved toward them, each step measured, each breath shallow. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the leather cord. The wrapped key was colder than the rest, as though it had absorbed the chill of secrets too long buried. But just as she began to lift it, a sound ripped through the silence. Thomas shifting in his bed, muttering in half-dream. Elizabeth froze, clutching the key so tightly the metal cut into her palm. "Elizabeth." His voice was thick with sleep, but it slithered through her like a knife. Her heart threatened to betray her. She forced her breathing slow, her body still as stone. After a long moment he rolled over, the snores resuming. Only then did he move. Carefully she slid the wrapped key free from the ring, leaving the others in their place. She clutched it to her chest, its cold weight an oath. Retreating into the hall, she closed the door with infinite care. The key now rested against her heart, a sliver of freedom, or damnation, claimed in the dead of night. Whatever door it opened, whatever truth it revealed, she knew this: there would be no turning back. Elizabeth had walked the East Wing corridor 100 times in her imagination, but never in her body. It was the one passage her father forbade, the one part of the estate he kept sealed behind a door older than her memory. Servants whispered about it, the room her mother had once occupied, the chamber of vows, the place where heaven and earth had touched. None dared linger near it. Now the stolen key pulsed against her palm, wrapped still in its blackened cloth. She approached the wing by lamplight, the flame shuddering as though sensing what she was about to disturb. The corridor narrowed, the air stale, untouched by the living. Cobwebs draped like mourning veils, and dust thickened beneath her feet. Portraits lined the walls, ancestors with pale faces, their eyes following her as if they knew what trespass she committed. At the end stood the door. It was taller than any other in the house, carved with symbols she could not name. They spiraled in patterns half-religious, half-profane, as though meant to guard rather than welcome. Her hands trembled as she fit the key into the lock. For a moment it resisted, as though the wood itself held breath. Then, with a groan that shook the silence, the mechanism yielded. The smell struck her first, something old, bitter, like herbs left too long in a damp cellar. She lifted her lamp and the shadows recoiled, revealing the room. It was not a chamber of rest, but of ritual. Candlesticks burned to stubs stood in iron holders, their wax hardened into rivers across the floor. A table, an altar perhaps, dominated the center, covered with tattered linens and a silver chalice, tarnished but still gleaming faintly. On the walls hung remnants of fabric, wedding veils perhaps, or burial shrouds, and scattered across the floor, half buried in dust, lay tiny shoes, children's shoes. Elizabeth's breath caught. She staggered back, pressing the lamp closer to the objects, needing to deny what her eyes told her. But there was no denying. Her father's forbidden chamber was not a sanctuary of devotion. It was a theater of binding where vows had been twisted into shackles. On the altar, a book lay open, its pages yellowed with time. She stepped closer, drawn to it despite the dread building in her chest. Written in her father's hand, its ink sharp and deliberate, were names, rows of them, and at the bottom of the most recent page, half finished, her own name, Elizabeth Hawthorne. The ink was still wet. Elizabeth froze. The lamp shook in her hand, casting frantic shadows across the altar as though the room itself recoiled from her discovery. Her name, half-written, glistening with wet ink, proved what she had long suspected but never dared to voice. Her father's will was not only law in the household, it was scripture, and he was still writing it. Her breath came shallow, ragged. She glanced back at the rows above her name. The list was not just long, it stretched back decades, each name marked with a date, some crossed with a red stroke, others left bare, as if awaiting completion. But what chilled her most was the repetition. Certain names appeared twice, sometimes 3 times. They were women's names, some followed by Hawthorne, others by their birth names. Her mother's name was there, once under her maiden lineage, once under Margaret Hawthorne. Both entries bore the same hand, the same ritual claim. Elizabeth realized then that the book was no mere register. It was a ledger of ownership, a document of ritual bondage, where daughters became wives, where wives became property, and property became sacrifice. The children's shoes littering the floor suddenly screamed in silence. She imagined them, tiny feet once bound in those shoes, their names perhaps never recorded, their existence erased, a whole generation fed into the ledger, swallowed by ink. Her hand hovered over her half-finished name, the ink still wet, her father's quill left on the altar as though he had been interrupted. Perhaps he had heard her footsteps, perhaps he meant to return. Terror warred with fury inside her chest. Was she already bound? Was the act of writing enough to claim her soul, or was the unfinished stroke her only salvation? Elizabeth slammed the book shut. The sound cracked through the chamber like a pistol shot, echoing against the stone. Dust fell from the rafters. For a moment, meant she thought the walls themselves would collapse. The lamp flickered, then steadied, and she knew whatever had been sealed here had now awakened. A draught passed through the room, though no window stood open. The veils on the wall fluttered, as if stirred by unseen hands, and in the corner, half hidden by shadow, she swore she saw movement. A figure, still, watching. Not her father. Something older. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the lamp, its flame quivering like her pulse. The shadow in the corner did not shift with the light. It stood independent, fixed, as if the darkness itself had chosen form. Her voice cracked when she spoke, though she forced strength into it. "Who's there?" No answer, only the faint rustle of cloth, like a veil dragging over stone. The air thickened, heavy with a musk of damp earth and old blood. Elizabeth's stomach turned, but she could not retreat. Behind her lay only the suffocating stairwell, a passage her courage would not carry her through twice. The figure leaned forward. Not a man, not entirely. Its outline was human, but its edges wavered, like smoke trying to imitate flesh. Where a face should have been, there was only an impression, a hollow mask, featureless, yet filled with a gaze that pinned her where she stood. Elizabeth remembered the names in the ledger, the repetition of women claimed, erased and reclaimed. Was this their remnant? Were these the souls bound to the Hawthorne name, waiting, watching, feeding? Her throat tightened, but she spoke again, each word deliberate. "You cannot have me." The silence after was unbearable. Then slowly the figure moved, not toward her but toward the altar, its hand pale as bone and dripping with something darker, extended over the book she had slammed shut. The pages stirred, fluttering like wings in a storm. The ledger opened to the very place her name had been written. The wet ink bled, spreading across the parchment as though invisible hands pressed the quill to continue the work. Letters formed of their own accord, dragging her unfinished name into completion. Elizabeth staggered back, nearly dropping the lamp. She wanted to scream, to run, but something inside her froze. If she fled, she knew the book would seal her fate without her ever touching it. For the first time, she understood the full cruelty of her father's faith. The family was not preserving a legacy, it was sustaining a covenant, an ancient pact that demanded women not merely as daughters, not merely as brides, but as offerings to something that had no shape, no mercy. The figure turned from the book and faced her again. It did not advance. It did not speak. It only waited as though testing her resolve. Elizabeth's choice was narrowing, collapsing around her like a trap. She had to decide, destroy the book, or let it write her into eternity. Elizabeth steadied her breath, though her chest felt like it might crack beneath the pressure. The lamp flickered violently, as though it too recoiled from the decision waiting to be made. Her gaze locked on the ledger, its pages rippling in a draft that did not exist, its ink still bleeding her name as though the book itself were alive. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself forward. She set the lamp down upon the altar, its light spilling directly over the cursed pages. The figure in the corner did not move, but the silence around her deepened, thickening like tar. Elizabeth whispered, not to the figure, not to her father, but to the women whose names lay buried within the book. "I am not yours. I will not be bound." The words tasted of iron, sharp and defiant. She reached for the ledger, the leather cold, almost damp, under her fingertips. Every instinct screamed against it, her mind filled with a chorus of whispers urging her to submit, to surrender, to allow the ink to dry. Instead, she yanked the book from the altar and slammed it shut again. The echo shook through the chamber, and for a moment the figure flickered, its outline breaking into fragments of smoke. Elizabeth seized the moment. She lifted the lamp high and let its flame lick the corner of the ledger. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The book seemed to resist the fire. Then, with a sudden hiss, the edges blackened, curling in on themselves, releasing a foul stench of scorched ink and rotting parchment. The chamber reacted like a wounded beast. The walls groaned, the chains rattled, the figure let out a low, guttural moan that reverberated through her bones. But Elizabeth did not stop. She pressed the flame harder into the book, the fire crawling greedily across its pages. The names, those endless names, flared bright, burning one after another until they were consumed in ash. With each name asked, the figure shrank, as though its very existence was tethered to the ledger's binding. Elizabeth's own name was the last to catch. For an instant, the letters pulsed with light, resisting, clinging to permanence. But then, with a final snap, they too dissolved into smoke. The figure screamed without sound, its form unraveling, thinning until it collapsed back into the shadows from which it came. Elizabeth staggered back, choking on the smoke and the stench. The lamp nearly slipped from her grasp, but she caught it, clutching it like her final lifeline. The ledger was gone. Only a mound of ash remained upon the altar. But the silence that followed was not relief. It was too heavy, too absolute. Elizabeth knew the covenant had been broken, but not ended. Something had been released. The silence did not last. At first Elizabeth thought it was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, but then the sound multiplied, low thuds rising from beneath the stone floor, rhythmic, deliberate, like 1,000 fists beating from within the earth. She staggered backward, clutching the lamp to her chest, as dust rained from the ceiling. The ashes on the altar stirred. They did not scatter as ordinary soot would. They coiled, lifting upward as if pulled by an unseen breath. Elizabeth's throat tightened. She had expected release. She had hoped for freedom. But what she had summoned was something else entirely. The chains lining the chamber began to rattle of their own accord, links clashing against stone. They sang in metallic chorus, filling the air with a dreadful cadence. Then the voices came, dozens at once, whispering over one another, rising into a single dissonant chant. Elizabeth clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound was not outside. It was inside her skull. The ledger had burned, but the covenant had not died. It had shifted. Elizabeth dropped to her knees, the lamp tilting dangerously in her hand. Her eyes watered from the acrid smoke, but in the haze she saw them, faces forming within the swirling ash. Faces of women, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in agony. Each one had been bound to the covenant before her, each name etched into that cursed ledger. They had not been freed, they had only been awakened. The whispers sharpened into words, layered and overlapping until she could make sense of them. Daughter, bride, keeper. Elizabeth shook her head violently, refusing the words. No, I destroyed it. You cannot bind me. The faces surged closer, their mouths stretching wide, their whispers now howls. The chains snapped from the walls, not breaking but slithering, like living serpents reaching toward her. She scrambled backward until her shoulders pressed against cold stone. Then she heard something worse than the voices. Steps. From the farthest end of the chamber, beyond the haze, beyond the ashes, came the sound of deliberate footsteps descending the staircase, each one struck with the certainty of someone who knew they were expected. Elizabeth froze, the lamp shaking violently in her grip. The chains retreated as if making way. The whispers quieted. The air itself seemed to bow. From the shadows a figure emerged, not the smoke-borne specter from before, but something more solid, more human. Its face was hidden beneath the hood of a ceremonial robe, black as the ash at her feet. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Her father had not left her after all. The figure stopped at the edge of the altar. For a long moment neither spoke. The smoke writhed around him as though drawn to his body, and the chains at Elizabeth's feet fell silent, coiled obediently, like dogs at their master's command. When he lowered the hood, Elizabeth's stomach turned to ice. It was her father. Not as she remembered him, not the weary patriarch with tired eyes and silver hair, but younger, sharper, as if the years had been stripped from him. His skin bore no sign of age, and his eyes burned with an unnatural clarity, black shot through with glimmers of red. Elizabeth's lips trembled. "You're supposed to be dead." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile he had worn when teaching her scripture as a child, gentle, patient, deceptive. "Death," he said softly, "is not the same for men like me. It is an adjustment." A passage. He stepped forward, his voice low and certain, each word pressing into her like an iron weight. "And you, my daughter, were always meant to carry me through." Elizabeth gripped the lamp tighter, her knuckles white. "I destroyed the ledger. It's over." His expression hardened, but amusement lingered in the corners of his mouth. "You think fire breaks covenant? You think ink on paper holds the chain? Foolish child." He raised his hand, and the ashes on the altar surged into a towering column. "The ledger was a vessel. You have only broken the jar. Now the river flows freely. And you—" He extended a finger toward her. "You are its new vessel." Elizabeth staggered back, bile rising in her throat. Her mind screamed to deny him, to reject every word, but a deeper part of her felt the truth pressing in. Why the whispers called her daughter, bride, keeper. Why the faces in the ash had not vanished, but clung to her instead. He had orchestrated everything, even her defiance. The burning of the ledger had not destroyed the curse. It had transferred it. Elizabeth shook her head violently, tears streaking her cheeks. "You used me. You damned me before I even drew breath." Her father's smile widened, pride and cruelty intertwined. "No, Elizabeth, I raised you. I fashioned you into the perfect vessel, daughter of blood, bride of shadow, keeper of the covenant." He reached out his hand, not in menace but in welcome. "Come, accept your place." Elizabeth felt the chains stirring again, alive, eager, waiting for her decision. The room was silent except for her ragged breathing. She could surrender and become the thing he had made her, or she could resist and shatter not just the covenant but herself. Elizabeth's chest heaved as her father's outstretched hand hovered before her, steady and patient, as though he already knew she would take it. The chains around her ankles tightened, their cold links biting into her skin, not to drag her down but to guide her forward. Her mind spun. Every prayer she had whispered, every hymn she had sung, every promise of salvation had all been part of his script. She wanted to scream, to claw at the walls until they crumbled, but instead she forced herself to breathe, to listen past her terror. The voices in the smoke whispered again, not just daughter, not only bride. They hissed another word, low and urgent: choice. Her father tilted his head, studying her trembling form. "You cannot fight this, Elizabeth. You will see in time that what I offer you is not damnation, but eternity. Together we will build a covenant no man can erase. You are the vessel. Without you, I am nothing. With you, we are infinite." Elizabeth wiped her tears with the back of her hand, staring at him through blurred vision. "You want me to be your vessel," she whispered, "to carry you, to carry them." "Yes," he said, his voice filled with certainty. Her trembling slowed, her breathing steadied. She lowered her eyes to the floor, feigning submission, letting her shoulders slump. The chains slackened slightly, mistaking her stillness for surrender. "Then," she said softly, her voice breaking just enough to sell the lie, "take me." Her father's smile spread wide, triumphant. He stepped closer, placing his hand over her heart, and she felt a searing heat tear through her chest, 1,000 voices pressing against her ribcage, clawing to enter. But in that moment, Elizabeth moved. With a sudden cry that split the silence, she raised the iron lamp and smashed it against the altar. Oil and flame erupted across the carvings, licking up the smoke, sear, sighing through the ashes. The whispers became shrieks, and the chains writhed in agony. Her father's eyes widened, not in anger, but in shock. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "What have you done?" Elizabeth stood, the fire's glow casting her in stark relief. "You said without me, you are nothing," she spat. Her voice no longer trembled. "Then you will have nothing." The room quaked as the covenant shuddered under her defiance. The choice had been made. The fire leapt greedily across the altar, devouring the carved symbols her father had etched over decades. Each flame was like a claw tearing into the parchment of his covenant, shredding it line by line. The smoke thickened, no longer whispering but howling, 1,000 broken voices crying out in rage as their tether to the mortal world was torn apart. Elizabeth staggered back, her arms shielding her face, but her eyes never left him. Her father stood rigid, his mouth open in a silent scream, his flesh rippling as though something inside him was trying to escape. His shadow stretched grotesquely against the stone walls, no longer matching the shape of his body. It elongated, warped, sprouted limbs that were not human. "Elizabeth!" His voice cracked, distorted, layered with tones that were not his own. "Stop this. You cannot break what was sealed in blood. You cannot defy them." The chains rattled violently, snaking around her legs and waist, trying to pull her toward the collapsing altar, but the fire bit into them too, searing the links until they cracked and fell away like brittle bones. For the first time, Elizabeth saw her father as he truly was. His face peeled, his skin gray and blistering, his eyes hollow pits of smoldering red, his body bent unnaturally, limbs twisting backward, his human form collapsing under the weight of what he had invited in. The air thickened, the chamber trembling as stones fell from the ceiling. The Covenant's collapse was not quiet. It was a violent undoing, a ripping apart of reality itself. The spirits bound to him shrieked as they were dragged screaming back into the abyss, their promises of eternity unraveling into smoke. Her father lurched toward her, not as a man but as something monstrous. "If you kill me, you kill yourself," he howled. "You are tied to me, Elizabeth. You are my vessel. We are bound." Elizabeth's hand clenched around a shard of the shattered lamp. Her body shook, not from fear but from fury. "No," she whispered, stepping into the blaze that circled the altar. "We were bound because you said so, but tonight I decide." The walls cracked, the floor split, and the fire roared higher, like judgment itself had been called. Elizabeth lunged forward, the shard of glass glinting in her trembling hand. For an instant, the monstrous figure that had once been her father staggered backward, not from fear but from disbelief that his daughter, his carefully groomed vessel, would dare raise her hand against him. "Elizabeth, think!" he roared, his voice cracking between human desperation and inhuman rage. "You will sever yourself. You will die in my place. The covenant is not broken by defiance. It is broken by blood." She hesitated, the glass quivering inches from his chest. Blood. His words echoed. Did the covenant hunger for her blood, or his? The flames hissed, curling around them, a circle of judgment. The air grew unbearable, thick with the scent of burning flesh and something older, fouler. The shadows of the chained spirits writhed in the fire, reaching, begging, cursing all at once. They were neither with him nor with her. They only wanted release. Elizabeth met her father's eyes. Beneath the grotesque mask, beneath the red embers where pupils should have been, she saw something she had never seen before. Fear. Not for himself, but for the Covenant's collapse. With a sudden cry that tore her throat raw, Elizabeth drove the shard deep into his chest. The sound was not human. It was the shriek of 1,000 contracts tearing at once, the howl of a pact dissolving in fire. Her father's body convulsed violently, limbs snapping backward, his mouth open in a scream that was swallowed by the roar of the flames. The glass cut her hand as she pulled it free, her own blood dripping into the fire. The ground shuddered, the chains writhed once more, then shattered into dust. Her father collapsed to his knees, his monstrous form crumbling as if the weight of centuries had suddenly been lifted. His face flickered between man and beast, but his voice, weak, broken, emerged only once more. You were never meant to choose." And with that, he fell into the fire, consumed completely, leaving nothing but ash and silence. Elizabeth stood alone in the ruin of the chamber, her breath ragged, her bloodied hand trembling. The air was still. The covenant was gone, but what she had severed she could not yet understand. The silence after her father's fall was unbearable. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth was not being watched, not being commanded, not being bound, but freedom did not feel like air filling her lungs. It felt like drowning. The flames guttered and died, leaving only smoke that clung to the stone walls like mourning veils. The chamber groaned as though the house itself had lost its master. Elizabeth pressed her bloodied hand against her chest, her heartbeat frantic, animal, unsteady. She stumbled up the spiral staircase, each step echoing like a verdict. When she pushed open the heavy oak door, the night greeted her, not as it had before, but changed. The grounds of Hawthorne Manor looked unfamiliar. The air was colder, sharper, as though the world itself had been stripped bare. She lifted her gaze and froze. Above the house, the stars flickered, not like distant lanterns but like wounded eyes blinking in pain. Constellations shifted, some collapsing into darkness altogether. It was as if the heavens had been tied to her father's covenant, and now, with its collapse, they were unraveling. From the village below, faint cries carried on the wind. Dogs howled, infants wailed, and bells tolled, though no hand pulled them. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. She realized the covenant had not been merely personal. It had been woven into the fabric of the land, binding the family to powers that touched every life in reach. Now unbound, those powers were free. A figure moved at the edge of the trees. Elizabeth's heart lurched. Dozens of shapes followed, emerging from the dark like shadows reclaiming flesh. The chained spirits, those who had been bound for generations, were free now, but freedom had not made them whole. Their faces were hollow, their eyes pits of hunger. They did not look at the house. They looked at her. Elizabeth stepped back, trembling, the taste of iron thick in her mouth. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The covenant was broken, her father was gone, but she understood now. The bargain was never destroyed, it was transferred, and she was the vessel. The shadows pressed closer. Their footsteps made no sound, yet the earth seemed to wither beneath them. Elizabeth's knees buckled. She wanted to flee, to run into the woods and never look back, but every instinct told her it would be useless. The air itself had weight, pulling her down like invisible chains. One of the spirits stepped forward, a woman with a face half-eaten by ash. Her lips moved, whispering words Elizabeth could not understand, yet felt inside her bones. "You are the seal. You are the door." Elizabeth clutched at her chest, gasping. A coldness spread inside her ribs, filling the hollow where her father's voice used to echo. His tyranny had been brutal, suffocating. Yet compared to this, his dominion was a cage. This was an abyss. She fell to her knees as the crowd of the dead encircled her. The stars above burned out one by one, as though the sky itself were a theater curtain collapsing over the world. The manor groaned behind her, sinking into its own rot. And then, silence. The spirits knelt, every last one, heads bowed, arms stretched outward, as if honoring not a girl but a queen. Elizabeth's breath caught. Their loyalty was not to her father. It had never been. It was to the blood itself. Her veins throbbed like molten iron. A scream tore from her throat, not of pain, but of becoming. She felt the covenant settle into her bones like a crown hammered into the skull. The land quieted, the howls ceased, the bells stilled. Elizabeth rose. No longer bound as daughter, no longer chained as bride, she was the covenant now. And the villagers, who would come crawling to the manor gates in fear of famine, in need of blessings, in awe of whispers, would never know the truth, that their salvation wore the face of a woman who had inherited not freedom, but dominion. She turned to the spirits, her voice steady though her soul quaked. "Then let it be done. I accept." The dead bowed deeper. The stars flickered back to life, colder, sharper, and forever changed. The Hawthorne curse had not ended. It had evolved. And Elizabeth was its living throne.